Here's what went down in space history in the month of June. June 3, 1965. Astronaut Ed White becomes the first American to perform a spacewalk. NASA's Project Gemini was a series of 10 manned flights during which techniques crucial to the success of the Apollo program were developed and practiced, such as rendezvous and docking, work procedures and flight plans, long-duration spaceflight, and extravehicular activity. On March 23, 1965, Gus Grissom and John Young carried out the first of these missions, Gemini 3, and qualified the Gemini spacecraft for manned flight. Gemini 4 sought to conquer two of Project Gemini's objectives at once: develop and test flight plans and work procedures, and carry out the first American EVA. Even though the EVA is what the mission is remembered for today, 60 years later, and one of the most iconic moments of 1960s space exploration, it was actually Gemini 4's secondary objective. The possibility of some sort of EVA taking place during Gemini 4 dates back to 1964. Astronauts James McDivitt and Ed White of NASA's second class of astronauts, the New 9, were named the prime crew of Gemini 4 in July 1964 and advocated for the inclusion of an EVA on their mission. On March 18, 1965, Soviet cosmonaut Alexei Leonov became the first person to walk in space during Vostok 2. Now that NASA needed to respond to the rival Soviets' accomplishment, leadership gave the final go for the inclusion of an EVA on May 25th, only a week before Gemini 4's liftoff. McDivitt and White lifted off from Launch Complex 19 on Cape Kennedy Air Force Station on June 3, 1965 at 10:16 a.m. local time. While this was not the first manned launch from Pad 19, nor the first manned launch of the Gemini Titan II rocket, it was the first internationally televised rocket launch, as well as the first mission controlled from Houston, Texas, rather than from Florida. About 4.5 hours into the mission, it was time to attempt the first American EVA. White began his spacewalk by drifting up and out of the cockpit. Tied to a tether, he floated around the outside of his and McDivitt's capsule, took photos, and maneuvered using the handheld maneuvering unit, a pressurized oxygen jet gun informally called the zip gun, losing a thermal glove in the process and exclaiming to Mission Control that he felt like $1 million. White was reluctant to re-enter the capsule, but the astronauts were approaching the solar terminator and would soon be enveloped in complete darkness, as well as be out of communication with the ground. The first American EVA lasted 23 minutes, and with it now complete, Gemini 4 focused on carrying out its primary mission objective of evaluating work procedures, schedules, and flight plans for astronauts spending an extended period of time in space. Over the next 4 days, the crew carried out 11 experiments and set a new manned American space endurance record. Gemini 4 returned to Earth on June 7th and splashed down 450 miles east of Cape Kennedy in the West Atlantic Ocean, and was recovered by the USS Wasp aircraft carrier. McDivitt and White were both transferred to the Apollo program in spring 1966. White was assigned as senior pilot of the first manned Apollo mission, but tragically, he and his crewmates Gus Grissom and Roger Chaffee lost their lives when their spacecraft's cockpit caught fire on the launch pad on January 27, 1967. McDivitt commanded Apollo 9, the third manned Apollo mission, in March 1969 and evaluated the lunar module's performance in low Earth orbit. June 8, 1959. A U.S. Navy Regulus guided missile delivers mail to Florida. In the late 1950s, the Post Office Department, the predecessor to the USPS, wanted a faster and more efficient way to deliver mail. As post-war American rocketry was made possible by the reverse engineering of the German V-2 rocket, reverse engineering the V-1 flying bomb produced the cruise missile. Cruise missiles are, quote, unmanned, self-propelled guided vehicles that sustain flight through aerodynamic lift, unquote. In August 1947, the U.S. Navy began Project Regulus, which sought to develop a cruise missile specifically for submarine deployment. The SSM N-8A Regulus was a nuclear-capable, turbojet-powered cruise missile in America's first sea-based nuclear deterrent. The Regulus had a length of 42 feet, a diameter of 4 feet and 8.5 inches, and a wingspan of 21 feet, and could carry a 3,000-pound warhead up to 500 nautical miles. Its first launch via submarine was off the deck of the USS Tunney in July 1953. The USS Barbera was a Balao-class diesel-electric submarine that completed 2 patrols in the Java and South China Seas during World War II. In 1955, she was converted to launch the Regulus I and joined the USS Tunney as the US's first nuclear deterrent patrol submarines. The Barbaro was stationed in Norfolk, Virginia, and carried out deterrent patrols in the Atlantic Ocean for 3 years, from mid-1956 to mid-1959. Before reassignment to the Pacific Fleet Submarine Squadron 1 at the start of July 1959, the Barbaro participated in an experimental mail delivery. The Post Office Department established an official post office branch on the submarine and received 3,000 commemorative postal covers containing letters from Postmaster General Arthur E. Summerfield, addressed to President Dwight D. Eisenhower, Vice President Richard Nixon, cabinet members, Supreme Court justices, members of the Universal Postal Union, and the crew of the USS Barbaro. This experiment was not announced to the public ahead of time, and Summerfield's office received several complaints from collectors who had not been given the opportunity to submit personal items for flight. The letters were placed in 2 red and blue mail containers that replaced the missile's nuclear warhead. Barbaro sailed to a spot in the Atlantic Ocean about 100 miles from the Naval Auxiliary Air Station in Mayport, Florida. Shortly before noon on June 8, 1959, and under the command of Captain Robert H. Blount, the Barbaro fired a training Regulus toward the naval station, and 22 minutes later, it landed. Postmaster General Summerfield was in attendance for the missile's touchdown, and said the event was, quote, of historic significance to the peoples of the entire world, unquote. The letters were forwarded to a post office in Jacksonville for sorting and distribution, and over the decades, some postal covers found their way into the hands of the public. Summerfield stated, quote, this peacetime employment of a guided missile for the important and practical purpose of carrying mail is the first known official use of missiles by any post office department of any nation. Before man reaches the moon, mail will be delivered within hours from New York to California, to Britain, to India, or Australia by guided missiles, unquote. Despite Postmaster General Summerfield's enthusiasm for the implementation of missile-delivered mail and the success of the experiment, this would be the only time a missile was used to carry mail in the United States. The ultimate downfall was its impracticality. Delivering mail using airplanes and conventional methods of transportation were cheaper and more reliable in the long run. Nevertheless, this peacetime employment of a guided missile was a unique experiment in communication transportation and a subtle flex of American missile accuracy. June 16, 1963, cosmonaut Valentina Tereshkova becomes the first woman in space. The Vostok program was the Soviet Union's first human space project, and like NASA's Project Mercury, aimed to put the first humans into space and return them safely to Earth. The first cosmonaut class was selected by the end of 1959, and in May 1960, 6 of those 20 men were chosen for accelerated training for upcoming Vostok missions, with 5 of them becoming the first Soviets to orbit planet Earth. Yuri Gagarin became the first person in space and the first person in orbit on April 12, 1961 on board Vostok 1. He was followed by Herman Titov's full-day Vostok 2 flight on August 6, 1961, in the dual Vostok 3 and Vostok 4, flown by Andrei Nikolaev and Pavel Popovich in August 1962. In late 1961, chief designer Sergei Korolev believed the next feat to trump the American space program, which had yet to put a man in orbit, was sending a woman into space. 5 female cosmonaut candidates were selected in February 1962 and competed amongst each other for Vostok 6, which was to fly with Vostok 5 in summer 1963. Valentina Tereshkova was chosen to pilot Vostok 6 in May 1963, with Irina Solovyova as her backup and Valentina Ponomaryova as the reserve pilot. Vostok 5 launched on June 14, 1963, and Tereshkova joined it in orbit on the 16th, lifting off from Site 1, now known as Gagarin Start, at 12:30 p.m. Moscow time. Vostok 6's orbital inclination of 65 degrees was the highest orbital inclination of a crewed spacecraft for more than 60 years. It was broken in 2025 by the polar orbiting private space mission Fram-2. The closest Vostok 6 came to Vostok 5 was about 3 miles, or 5 kilometers, during Vostok 6's first orbit, and the two established radio contact. As their distance from one another grew, communications degraded, and by the second day of flight, they could no longer speak directly to each other. During Tereshkova's third orbit, she received a congratulatory call from Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Her first attempt at manually orienting the spacecraft for a simulated landing engine firing was unsuccessful, as she struggled to reach the instrument panel while fastened in her seat. In fact, she was unable to perform the biological experiment because she could not reach it. She observed city lights and fires on the ground, clouds and lightning in Earth's atmosphere, and the moon. Tereshkova's physical condition deteriorated due to the poor quality of her space food and body pains and discomfort. Vostok 6 re-entered on June 19th after completing 48 orbits. It was standard procedure for Vostok cosmonauts to eject from the descent module as it hurtled to the ground and touch down under their own parachutes, since the Vostok had no soft landing capabilities. Tereshkova touched down about 385 miles, or 620 kilometers, northeast of Karaganda in Kazakhstan, and about a quarter mile, or 400 meters, from her descent module. Valery Bukovsky returned to Earth on the same day. Vostok 6 mission elapsed time was 2 days, 22 hours, and 50 minutes, and spacecraft Chaika is now on display at the RKK Energia Museum in Korolyov in Moscow Oblast. With Vostok 5 and Vostok 6's success, the Vostok program came to an end, and the Soviet space program pushed forward with the short-lived, multi-person Voskhod program. No woman would fly in space again until Svetlana Savitskaya in 1982. June 29, 1995. Space Shuttle Atlantis docks to Space Station Mir for the first time. The joint American-Russian Shuttle Mir program was the precursor to the International Space Station, during which astronauts and cosmonauts flew on each other's spacecraft and NASA gained long-duration spaceflight experience on Space Station Mir. STS-71 Atlantis was the third of these missions and the first time the shuttle docked with Mir. Atlantis lifted off from LC-39A at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida on June 27, 1995, after 2 previous scrubs on June 23rd and June 24th. STS-71 was also the 100th American crewed space launch. Atlantis docked with Mir at 9 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time on June 29th, and combined made up the largest spacecraft to ever orbit Earth at the time, with a total mass of about 225 metric tons. While 251 miles, or 404 kilometers, over Earth, the hatches of both opened, and Mir-18 commander Vladimir Dezhurov and STS-71 commander Robert Hoot Gibson shook hands in homage to Alexei Leonov and Tom Stafford's historic handshake during the Apollo-Soyuz test project 20 years earlier. The first crew exchange between the space shuttle and a space station was conducted when 2 cosmonauts, Anatoly Solovyev and Nikolai Budarin, were brought to Mir to relieve Gennady Strekalov and Vladimir Dezhurov. Norm Thagard, the first American to launch on a Russian vehicle, was also retrieved. The latter 3 spacemen made up the crew of Mir-18 and had been living in space since mid-March. During the 5 days Atlantis was docked with Mir, the crew conducted joint life science experiments aboard the Spacelab module in the orbiter's payload bay, using the extended duration Mir-18 crew as test subjects, talked with several schools during the Shuttle Amateur Radio Experiment 2, and filmed with an IMAX camera. On July 4th, Atlantis undocked from the big space station, and the Mir-19 crew, cosmonauts Budarin and Solovyev, flew a Soyuz spacecraft away from Mir to photograph Atlantis and Mir together. Upon undocking, STS-71 tied the record for the largest crew in space history with 8 people. Only STS-61A Challenger in 1985 flew that many people. Atlantis returned to Earth on July 7th and was succeeded by 8 more Shuttle Mir dockings, 6 of which were carried out by Shuttle Atlantis.